I was asked to talk about two things in this talk. One is the meaning and measurement of fear of crime, and the other is the impact of neighbourhoods on fear of crime. And I think these are two important issues. I'm talking from a criminological perspective, and there's a good deal of research on public insecurities, public anxieties, fear of crime, worry about crime, etc. Good deal of literature in the criminological literature, criminological studies in the criminological literature. However, two themes emerge again and again, almost repetitiously. One, that fear of crime is a complex and contested concept, idea. Everyone says it's more complicated than everyone else thinks. The other is the relationship between fear of crime and the neighbourhood context. So these are important themes, and I think the beginnings of an understanding of the fear of crime literature within criminology should perhaps start with these two issues. So hopefully this could be a helpful introduction to a field of inquiry. So I'll begin by talking about what fear of crime is. I'll go over the latest criminological thinking on meaning and measurement. I'm very empirically minded, so I'll give you a history of the concept, but I'll show you some data. Then I'll move into the question of why or whether neighbourhood matters. To what extent does the built environment, social and physical ecologies, etc., to what extent do these help explain individual and neighbourhood level variance in fear of crime? And finally, just very selfishly, but I think it's interesting, I'm working on a few papers which try to look at a complex and reciprocal relationship between people's perceptions and the neighbourhood context, and I'll explain what that means when we get there. So, this is from a British context, although I imagine this translates to many other countries. We should start off by saying that public anxieties about crime are nothing new. If you look at the criminological literature, you often get the sense that fear of crime was invented in the 1960s in America and kind of migrated into Western Europe in the 1970s and 1980s. This, of course, isn't true. What is true is that the sorts of methodologies that were developed in the social sciences emerged in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, surveys, systematic qualitative approaches, etc. All of these methodologies and the willingness to understand the nature and levels of fear of crime produced increasing knowledge and increasing understanding, and in a sense highlighted what has been there and ebbed and flowed over the last 2 or 3 decades, and some very nice historical books that have looked at how, for example, in late 19th century London, the mass media stoked public anxieties about Jack the Ripper. It was a very famous set of murders in London. So fear of crime is nothing new. However, when criminologists think about fear of crime, they tend to think about a concept and an idea that is operationalized through surveys, through methodologies. Of course, there's a lot of qualitative work, but the survey dominates this area. And I think it's therefore important to trace back the roots of how fear of crime is defined and been measured. And the roots go back to the US government in the 1960s. The government was concerned about social unrest, about the civil rights movement, and in particular about public anxieties, about crime, civil unrest, etc. And they started to develop measures to try to understand who and why the US citizens are concerned about crime. And I've just put up a rather idiosyncratic collection of measures of what was then termed anxieties about crime. And these are all kind of combined together to produce some kind of scale. So what was it about the neighbourhood that was most important? These are survey questions asked to citizens. Safety or moral characteristics, convenience or aesthetic characteristics. It's a terrible survey question. When you think about the chances of getting beaten up, would you say this neighbourhood is very safe, about average, less safe than most, one of the worst, etc.? there's a sense in which these surveys were capturing a rather haphazard collection of perceptions and concerns. In another survey at that time, a different set of questions were asked. And you'll see where I'm going with this, hopefully, very soon. So this was a study, I think, carried out in the Washington, D.C. area. And one of the questions was, how safe do you feel walking alone in your neighborhood after dark? But another question was, how concerned are you about having your home broken into? Now, there's a history of the critiquing of these sorts of measures, and the idea that they're reflecting rather unfocused concepts in not a very helpful way. And this perceived safety question started to dominate research in the 1970s and 1980s. So how safe do you feel walking alone in your neighborhood after dark? And a number of US criminologists criticized it for not being precise. It's capturing both thoughts, your perceptions of risk, and feelings, how you feel, feelings of unsafety. It doesn't mention crime, many different reasons why people might feel unsafe in particular areas. It's hypothetical. Many people don't walk alone in their area after dark, out of habit or for other reasons, or they're always just with other people or whatever. I just want to make the point that for fear of crime to have a kind of a definite purpose or a definite meaning, we need to start to define it rather more concretely. And I would argue that we need to start to think about fear of crime as everyday emotions, specifically about the threat of victimization. And then there was some methodological work that was carried out in the US, recommendations to think, on the one hand, about perceptions of risk, ask people how likely do you think it is. On the other hand, ask people about everyday emotions. How fearful are you? Or how worried are you? So you start to disentangle, on the one hand, perceptions of the likelihood, on the other hand, let's say emotional responses to such perceived risk. So you don't combine them and conflate them into one, rather start to disentangle them. And hopefully you'll see how that's useful soon. So I've mentioned that I think for some kind of conceptual precision, it might be useful to think about fear of crime as everyday emotions. The emotions that people feel on an everyday basis, or going about their everyday life, specifically about the threat of crime. Sounds obvious, I guess, but I would also like to push the idea that, in some sense, people have many different emotions and many different thoughts and feelings about crime. We get on with our lives, we manage risk, etc. And maybe it'd be a good idea if we start to think about fear of crime as having a negative effect. So, in some sense, it constrains behaviors, it reduces well-being, etc. And I've got a little model here, which is based on a prospective cohort study, the Whitehall 2 study in the UK, which follows people longitudinally over time and looks at the relationship between poor mental health and physical health and how that might predict fear of crime through a series of pathways. But the most important point is that actually there's evidence that there's a kind of reciprocal effect. So fear of crime damages physical and psychological well-being, which can then create a kind of spiral of vulnerability through various different pathways I've sketched out here. So there's a sense in which there's a core to this thing which actually makes a difference, has a negative impact on people's lives, reduces physical and psychological well-being, which can increase vulnerability, which can then increase fear of crime, etc. You can have a spiral. Now, if anyone's interested, we're in Sweden now. Sweden's long been part of the European Social Survey. The European Social Survey has a series of measures which I think are particularly good. These questions differentiate between burglary on the one hand and violence on the other. They ask how often, if at all, do you worry about becoming a victim of burglary or a victim of violence? And then, does this worry have a serious effect or not on your quality of life? And there's 4 questions in the European Social Survey. These, in some sense, capture everyday emotions. They ask, in your life, how often do you do this? And they also ask, to what extent does this affect your everyday life? So it's starting to get some precision in what we mean by fear of crime. Now, there's been some analysis to see whether these items somehow scale together to form one index, and they do. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is the all-important league table of levels of fear of crime across Europe. You'll be very pleased, actually you'll be very surprised to see Sweden only in the middle of this. Norway, Denmark and Finland have the least levels of fear of crime. Bulgaria, Slovakia, Russia, France, Portugal and Ukraine have the most. Tends to be Eastern European and Southern Mediterranean countries. It tends to be Eastern European and Southern Mediterranean countries. France is one exception. I don't know why. If you do some kind of modelling actually and try to explain through a more kind of rigorous approach, the biggest factor is the extent of welfare state provision and the particular types of welfare state provision, which explains Norway, Denmark and Finland. Perhaps doesn't quite explain why Sweden is in the middle, but there you go. So, I also just want to say, take-home message here is that I think personally, if we think about fear of crime, we need to be very precise and we need to think about the everyday worries or anxieties or fears that you have, you experience in your life that have a negative impact, I think. But there is more to this concept than that. I don't have time to go through these in much detail, but I just want to mention briefly 4. First and foremost, if you read, let's say, the classic review of the literature, which is by Chris Hale in 1996, he talks about how fear of crime can be thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I'll say a little bit about that. In the UK, there's lots of qualitative work from Human Geography by Rachel Payne, from Sociological Criminology by Ian Loden, Richard Sparks and Evie Gerling, and I guess there's lots of qualitative work in other countries, which looks at sensibilities. It tries to tease out the social and cultural significance of crime in people's lives. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Then there's, I'm a psychologist, and psychologists have long documented all the problems of trying to measure people's everyday emotions, emotional self-reports. And actually, frankly, you shouldn't trust what people say in response to questions about their emotions in surveys. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk a little bit about functional and dysfunctional, the idea that fear of crime actually could be a way of managing everyday risk. So, first, the ABCs, affective, behavioral and cognitive, thoughts, feelings and emotions that we have towards the perceived threat of crime. So there's some work that's tried to tease out different feelings. So fear, the physical sense of fear. Anxiety, the kind of bubbling under, the sort of low-level state of unease. Worry, a kind of more repetitious cognitive activity. And then you can think of behaviors. Perhaps it's a good idea to measure fear of crime by dint of what they do. To what extent do they take precautions as a response to crime? To what extent do they move to different areas, make certain decisions about which house or which areas to move to? And then cognitive, perceptions or evaluations of the likelihood of victimization, but also feelings of control. To what extent do you feel able to control your sense of threat or control your particular risk? And also consequence. To what extent do you feel that victimization would have a big or small consequence in your life? How vulnerable do you feel to the impact? Now, I want to say a little bit about what economists call problems of endogeneity. This simply means that you observe associations between things. Let's say you observe associations between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. What do you make of these associations? Let's say they're strongly associated. What do you make of this? In some sense, you probably want to make up some kind of causal model that people's thoughts about crime, in some sense, cause their behaviors, cause their emotions. But it could be the other way around, that your emotions cause your thoughts, or your emotions cause your behaviors. Now, I've got one, this picture here is one way of specifying the arrow of causality. So there's some research that's looked at people's perceptions of risk, the thoughts about victimization. How likely do you think it is you'll be victimized? How much do you feel able to control victimization? To what extent would it have a big effect on your everyday life? And there's been some research that's linked these perceptions of risk and feelings of vulnerability to subsequent emotion. However, just as plausibly, it could work the other way around. There's lots of psychological research that suggests that people who are anxious or worried overestimate the chances of bad things happening. So the arrow could go both ways. And there could be a reciprocal effect over time. You could equally say the same thing about behavior. So it's quite complex. A few words on qualitative research and cultural sensibilities. So there's been a lot of work in Britain particularly, which has used qualitative and ethnographic approaches to listen to people how people talk about crime, how people talk about the significance of crime and unrest and disorder in their immediate environments and more broadly in the nation at large, and how issues of crime allow them to make sense and grapple with broader questions of social order, politics, culture, and justice, and allows them to make sense of intergroup conflict as well. Allows them to tell you a story and allows them to make sense of their position in the world and the position of their particular neighborhood or their particular town or their particular country and in its particular historical point. So the trajectory of social change and how things are getting worse or better and why and who's to blame, etc. So the qualitative research is an important kind of corrective to all of the quantitative stuff that I'm going to bombard you with. I want to say a little word about trying to unpack everyday emotions. I mentioned that there's a good deal of social psychological research on what people mean when you ask them, how happy are you? Or how worried are you about losing your job? Or how worried are you about being burgled? We want to, in some sense, infer from people's questions actual everyday emotions that are experienced either now or regularly. But there's lots of research which suggests that this isn't true, and people are not drawing upon experiential knowledge, but rather, in some sense, beliefs about past emotions and identity-related issues. I was involved in a study which tried to disentangle some of the complexity that underlies answers to questions like, how worried are you about being burgled? And we inserted questions into the British Crime Survey, which you've heard about today and yesterday. The questions were, these new questions. In the past year, have you ever felt worried about being burgled? If they said yes, how frequently? And then, on the last occasion, how worried did you feel in this particular case? We had answers to these frequency questions. Have you worried in the past year? We also had answers to standard questions. How worried are you? And we figured that there might be some divergence. Some people might say, I'm worried about being burgled. And then when you follow it up, well, in the past year, have you ever worried about being burgled? They might say no. We figured there might be some discrepancies here on the basis of psychological work on emotions, etc. In fact, our results were quite striking. What we did was we found that, for example, let's say, I think 15% of people in the British Crime Survey said they were very worried about being mugged or robbed. So these are people saying they're very worried, the top end of the scale. Later on in the questionnaire, we asked them, in the past year, have you ever worried about being mugged or robbed? About 2/3 of these people who said they were very worried said no. They couldn't remember a single instance in the past year that they'd worried. Now, we could have concluded from this that the questions aren't very well worded. Or we could conclude that actually we need to be less naive about what's being measured here, and that maybe when people say they're worried about something, but then can't recall a specific instance in which they felt at threat, walking down a street, signs of danger around them, At that particular moment, they thought, oh my God, I'm going to be mugged. For these people, we might think of fear of crime as a kind of low-level anxiety. So it's not a kind of worry that bubbles up into particular moments, but rather a kind of submerged feeling of concern and anxiety. And just kind of playing around with people's answers to these questions allowed us to identify a number of groups, which I've got up here in the top left. 54% of our sample just weren't worried. However you asked the question, they weren't worried. But 21% of people said they were worried about having a car stolen or being mugged or being burgled, but couldn't recall a single instance in the past year when they had actually worried about these instances. And then a further 21% said they were worried and could recall. And then finally, a 4% of our sample worried at least once a week or more. Why am I telling you this? Well, actually, one of the most important findings here was that this frequently worried group, the people who had worried at least once a week or more in the past year, tended not only to say that fear of crime reduced their quality of life a lot, but also they tended to live in areas in which you think they probably should be worrying about crime. So heavily concentrated, deprived areas with high crime rates. So this allowed us to say something about what's often referred to as the paradox between crime and fear. Lots of people are fearful of crime, but their risk seems to be low. Well, maybe one of the problems here is that we have crude measures, and that for some reason, many of us are anxious about crime. But there's a hardcore group of people who worry on an everyday basis. And it seems like they have reason to worry, at least according to our data. Okay, I don't think I have time to read out that quote, but I want to say something more. Just one more way of kind of packing these kind of headline measures. How worried are you about crime? So this is another study which looked at functional fear or dysfunctional fear. And what we found here is that 25% of the people who said they were worried about crime, when we followed them up with a series of questions, it transpired that they took precautions, transpired that these precautions made them feel safer. And also, crucially, their quality of life was not reduced by their precautions or their fear of crime. This would not surprise any psychologists. Worry is traditionally thought as a problem-solving activity. It's only when it becomes a kind of frequent negative experience should we think of it as a problem. We worry about lots of different things. If it leads us to do problem-solving, then it's not a bad thing. And in some sense, then a proportion of our sample, probably when they said they were worried about crime, probably referred or meant that they were aware of a risk and they took precautions and they feel like they're managing their risk. So they have some resilience. And it's only if you ask these follow-up questions and unpack the concept do you start to appreciate that. Otherwise, the danger is that policymakers and the mass media and everyone else just looks at the headline levels, 35% of fear of crime, and just assumes all of this is negative. We've got to reduce this. Well, maybe if you reduce some of it, then it might lead some people to take less precautions. I'm hammering this point home too much, I think, at this point, but you can then combine the different ways of unpacking fear of crime into one scale. So you move on the one hand at the top here, the unworried. However you ask the question, they're not worried about crime. You can move down this scale from the anxious, functional. So these people don't worry on an everyday basis. It seems like their low-level anxiety is motivating, perhaps leads them to take precautions, which perhaps they think helps them manage their risk. Sort of sensible, everyday precautions to live in a seemingly relatively dangerous society. All the way down to the bottom. In this particular sample, there was 16% of these people who were worried and felt like their quality of life was hindered or hampered. I think this sort of methodology, I'm a methodologist really, I guess, this particular methodology would be especially powerful for longitudinal work. If you think about people over the life course, you think about how through generations or over years or over decades, stages of life, how at certain points you'll be managing risk better than others, your emotions will be ebbing and flowing, etc. And what you want is a methodology that captures the kind of rich complexities of people's anxieties. And this sort of methodology might be a good start. So hopefully I've given you some sense of some of the nuances and complexities in trying to unpack what anxieties and insecurities about crime are. I want to move on to the notion of whether and why neighbourhood matters. In this case, I'm going to present a series of studies, and here the response variable, the thing that we're predicting, is the intensity of worry. So ignore all the caveats I just made about subtleties and nuances within the concept. This is just trying to explain variation in the top line measure of fear of crime. Now, this is I'm going to begin by describing some work by two colleagues of mine, which is currently under review. Ian Brunton-Smith from the University of Surrey and Patrick Sturgis from the University of Southampton. Now, from my point of view, there's surprisingly little data in criminology and elsewhere on the effect of the built environment on fear of crime. And I mean systematic data, so large-scale data that draws upon neighborhood-level data and analyzes geographically clustered sample data appropriately. Multi-level modeling, the sort of ecological analysis that we heard about this morning, etc. Some of this work has been done. Most of it's in the US. Most of it's on single cities, which has its strengths, but also its weaknesses. Much of it hasn't tested multiple mechanisms simultaneously, and much of it has included in the modeling the individual perception of the neighborhood, which may not seem a problem on the surface. I'll come back to why that is potentially a problem in a second. Let me just give you a quick snippet of what Brunton-Smith and Sturgis found. Talk about the method first. So they pulled data from, is that 3 years? Yeah, 3 years of the British Crime Survey. If you do that, you find that there's 105,000, just over 105,000 individuals. These are nested within medium super output areas, which we heard about again this morning. Nested once more in larger areas, in this particular case, crime and disorder reduction partnerships. So you've got individuals who live in a neighborhood. You've got neighborhoods which are clustered within bigger localities defined according to how local agencies try to tackle crime. This may be too much information, but they had special license data, so they managed to get from the Home Office where people lived. If you don't get this special license, they won't tell you for confidentiality reasons. And then when you find out where people live, you can then start creating a data set, try to somehow capture the sort of area that individuals lived in. And again, like we heard this morning, you can gather data that allows you to examine social disorganization, social economic disadvantage, urbanicity, population mobility, neighborhood age profiles, etc. The sorts of structural characteristics of a neighborhood which inhibit or create or allow to flourish social cohesion and collective efficacy. And they included measures of ethnic diversity and, nicely, the interviewers, so the people who went to the house, took a measure of the level of disorder in that neighborhood, in that street, and you can aggregate that up to the area. This is multi-level modeling. So you're predicting individual levels of fear of crime. What factors are associated with higher or lower levels of worry about crime? You have individual level correlates, characteristics of the people that you speak to. And they found that fear of crime was higher, this is consistent with lots of other research, amongst females, people with poor health, those identified as more socioeconomically disadvantaged, repeat experience of household or personal victimization, and readers of, in Britain we call them the tabloids, the kind of low class newspapers. However, this is multi-level modeling, so we find individuals clustered within areas, and we have measures of the area. And you can look at whether the measures of the area explain individual level fear of crime. And they found that individuals who lived in areas with greater ethnic diversity, social economic disadvantage, urban areas, and also areas with higher crime levels, and areas in which the interviewers saw as disorderly. And in fact, these neighbourhood characteristics explain some of the neighbourhood clustering as well. I don't know if I have a slide for that. Finally, interestingly, they found that, so we have individual level factors and neighbourhood level factors that explain why some people are worried about crime whilst others aren't. But they also found complex interactions between the individual and the neighbourhood. So, for example, if you've been a recent victim of crime, especially if you've been a recent repeat victim of crime, and you live in a high crime area, then you're especially likely to be fearful. So you have nice interactions between individual experiences or characteristics and neighbourhood. How am I doing for time, Vanya? 10 minutes? 2 or 3? Yeah. Ooh. Okay, I'll speed up. So also the survey asks those individuals about their perceptions of the neighbourhood. So the survey doesn't just ask how worried are you, but also to what extent do you think your neighbourhood has problems of young people hanging around, graffiti, litter, social cohesion problems, trust, collective efficacy, etc. So you might think it would be interesting if we're starting to look at interactions between individuals and their environment to capture also what those individuals see in their environment. Now, these authors stopped at this point, but in actual fact, this is the starting point for lots of other criminological research. So this is a well-cited study from the US, which linked the environment to public individual perceptions of disorder, which then linked that to perceived risk and finally to fear and behaviour. Now, I think there's a pretty plausible and simple theoretical story. People live in an environment, you read levels of disorder from your environment, you then read from the levels of disorder your perceived risk. People are kind of lay criminologists. You think, well, in disorderly environments, there's going to be a higher risk of crime, and this perceived risk then leads to fear and behaviour. God, I'm running out of time here. Why did they stop, though? Why didn't they include public perceptions of disorder in their model? Well, it goes back to the issue that I raised 15 minutes ago, I guess. Problems of endogeneity. You ask the same people about disorder as you ask about their worry about crime. And which way does the arrow of causality go? Does it go from disorder to fear of crime, or does it go the other way around? Or is there one big omitted variable which explains this correlation? I think it's just as plausible that fear of crime shapes how people make sense of their environment. Not that how you make sense of the environment shapes fear of crime, but the other way around. I think it's just as plausible that both things happen. So, fear of crime, according to this idea, encourages the endorsement of negative stereotypes about young people, about ethnic groups, about community conditions. It encourages the association of these individuals and these community characteristics with crime. We know from psychological research that emotions strengthen and direct beliefs. And if you're emotional about an issue, you feel strongly about it, right? So it's perfectly possible that fear of crime itself is making people less tolerant and more sensitive to low-level issues of social order and disorder and neighbourhood breakdown. Well, hold on. I got hold of their data with these authors. I swapped the response variables around. And you can run the same model, explaining perceived disorder or explaining worry about crime. In both cases, let's say we start to explain perceived disorder. individual perceptions of the young people hanging around in their areas. If you start to explain that using the same models, you find the same neighbourhood characteristics, social disorganisation, crime, etc. You also find that fear of crime is a strong predictor, net of everything else, holding constant neighbourhood, holding constant demographic issues, etc. So it may be that the environment is influencing people, but that there's a complex individual reciprocal effect over time between both your fear of crime and your perceptions of disorder. How would we test that? You need panel data. You need a longitudinal study. You need to follow individuals over time. Actually, there is such a study, and actually I've done the analysis. So the British Household Panel Study follows people over time, repeats observations, and you can look at whether changes in people's attitudes are associated with other changes in other attitudes or behaviours. So, well, let me skip that. So there's 3 waves of this data, and you can empirically show that increasing perceptions of disorder over time are associated with increasing levels of fear of crime over time. This is between time point 1 here and time point 2 here. But then there's a knock-on effect. From time point 2 to time point 3, from here to here, increasing levels of fear of crime are associated with increasing levels of perceived disorder, and vice versa. Decreasing levels of fear are associated with decreasing levels of disorder. So there's a kind of vicious circle or a virtuous circle, depending on which way it's going. Over time, there's a kind of knock-on effect. Also, there's an interaction effect. So it depends on your initial levels of fear of crime or your initial levels of perceived disorder. So the more fearful you get, the bigger impact it has on your perceptions of disorder. So there's a kind of, it really is a vicious circle. It sort of gets stronger and stronger and stronger over time. People endorse more and more negative stereotypes. They're less and less tolerant to low-level signs of social disorder and breakdown. Okay. So, firstly, fear of crime is nothing new. This has been documented in the UK. I'm sure it's true of pretty much every other country in the world. You do get a little bit of a sense that it's a kind of new phenomenon in at least the Western European and Northern American literatures. It's clearly not true. But what is true is that, in the last few decades, we've developed surveys and qualitative techniques to capture this. It's become measurable. So it's therefore important to understand what we mean by it and how we measure it. And hopefully I've just demonstrated very quickly some of the variability that underpin what is quite a complex set of emotions and responses. Then it matters which neighbourhood you live in. So the work that Brenton Smith and Sturgis have done is just shown using high quality data that neighbourhood level processes of social disorganisation and crime seem to be important, but that there's interactions between individuals and where you live. And then finally, it seems like there is interactions within individuals. Your perceptions of disorder and cohesion and collective efficacy change over time according to your levels of fear of crime. Your fear of crime is somehow sensitizing you to disorder, ambiguous cues in your environment. So there's complex interactions between the individual and the neighborhood and the individual over time. Okay, sorry, I went a bit too long.